The first time I saw him, he filled the entire doorway of my one-room schoolhouse, a shadow that blotted out the September sun. He was a mountain of a man, built by the harsh Wyoming prairie itself. 6.5 feet of weathered muscle, with shoulders that looked like they could carry the weight of the whole world. He held his dusty Stetson in his hands big enough to snap a fence post in two. But he held that hat like it was a fragile bird. His name was Boaz Cutter, a name whispered in Red Fern Ridge with a mix of fear and respect. He owned the biggest ranch in 3 counties, a man who spoke little and worked hard, a man who kept to himself. I was Abigail Wynn, the town schoolteacher. At 33, I'd made my peace with being a spinster. My dreams of a husband and children were buried deep, under years of lonely nights and quiet suppers for one. He took a step inside, and the floorboards groaned under his weight. The children went silent, their eyes wide. Little Tommy Fletcher stopped struggling with his multiplication tables and just stared. Boaz Cutter was a legend, the kind of man who fought off wolves with a knife, the kind of man you didn't cross. And he was looking right at me. His eyes were the color of rich earth after a rain, and they held a sadness that seemed out of place in such a powerful man. "Miss Wynn," he said, and his voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Might I have a word?" I followed him out onto the small porch, my heart hammering against my ribs. What could the most powerful man in the county want with the lonely schoolteacher? My mind raced. Was one of the children in trouble? Had I offended him somehow? He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The prairie didn't care for pretty words, and neither did Boaz Cutter. He got straight to the point, and the words he spoke shattered the quiet, predictable world I had so carefully built around myself. "I need a wife," he declared, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. I stared at him, speechless. The wind whipped a strand of hair across my face, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. But he wasn't finished. He looked me straight in the eye, his gaze so intense it felt like he could see right into my soul, right into the lonely corners I kept hidden from everyone, even myself. "And you," he said, his voice dropping a little lower, a little softer. "You need strong sons to guard your winters." It wasn't a proposal. It was a statement of fact, a business transaction laid bare under the unforgiving Wyoming sun. My mind reeled. Marriage, to this giant, this stranger, for security, for sons, the idea was outrageous. It was insulting. It was the most sensible thing anyone had said to me in years. I should have been offended. I should have told him that my life was my own, that I didn't need a man to protect me. I had survived 8 years on this frontier alone. I had built a life of purpose and respect. But his words had struck a nerve, a raw, aching nerve I thought I had buried long ago. "You need strong sons to guard your winters." He saw my future as clearly as I did. The slow, creeping loneliness, the pitying looks from the town's married women, the fear of growing old and frail with no one to care for me. "Mr. Cutter," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. I hardly know you." "You know I'm an honest man," he replied, his voice unwavering. "You know I work hard, and my ranch is prosperous. I'm offering you a home, security, and my name. In return, I need an heir, a son to carry on my name and inherit this land." He didn't speak of love. He didn't speak of affection. He spoke of contracts and legacies. It was cold. It was brutal. And yet, there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of something I couldn't name, not just practicality. It looked like desperation. "Why me?" I asked, the question escaping my lips before I could stop it. "There are younger women in this town, prettier women." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I don't want a girl," he said, his voice rough. "I want a woman who knows her own mind, who's faced hardship and hasn't broken. I've watched you, Miss Wynn. I've seen how you manage this school, how you've earned the respect of this town. You're strong. You're a survivor." He was offering me a partnership, not a romance. A fortress against the coming winter of my life. And as I stood there, looking at this powerful, solitary man, I realized he was building a fortress too. But what was he so afraid of? "I'll have a contract drawn up by the lawyer in Sage Creek," he said, as if my agreement was a foregone conclusion. "It will be fair. You'll want for nothing." He paused, and his gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "Think on it, Miss Wynne, but don't take too long. Winter is coming." He tipped his hat, turned, and walked away, leaving me standing on the porch with my world spinning. He hadn't just offered me a marriage of convenience. He had offered me a lifeline. But as I watched him ride away, his broad back a bulwark against the vast, empty prairie, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who was drowning. And I wondered if the lifeline he was offering me was also meant to save himself. That night I agreed. I sent a boy with a note to his ranch. A single word. Yes. I told myself it was for survival, for respectability, to silence the whispers that followed me through town like ghosts. But if I was being honest, a part of me was drawn to the mystery of Boaz Cutter, to the sadness in his eyes and the desperation I had sensed just beneath the surface. I was a teacher. I solved problems. And Boaz Cutter was the most complex problem I had ever encountered. 2 weeks later, we were married. The ceremony was short and stark, held in the small church with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. I wore my best blue wool dress. Boaz wore a suit that looked uncomfortably tight across his massive shoulders. We spoke the vows, promising to honor and care for one another. The word love was never mentioned. He lifted my hand and pressed a dry, formal kiss to my knuckles. "Mrs. Cutter," he said, and the name felt foreign on my own skin. The ride to his ranch was silent and awkward. I sat on the wagon seat, my hands folded primly in my lap, clutching the small bag that held all my worldly possessions. The house was even bigger up close, a fortress of logs and stone, built to withstand the harshest Wyoming blizzards. It was immaculate, organized, and utterly devoid of a woman's touch. It was a house, but it wasn't a home. "Your room is upstairs," he said, his voice gruff as he carried my trunk. "Second door on the left. It faces east. You'll get the morning sun." Separate rooms. It was part of our agreement, a practical arrangement. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As I walked up the stairs, the silence of the house pressed in on me. It was a lonely house, the house of a man who had lived with ghosts for a long time. My room was simple, but he had made an effort. There was a small writing desk by the window, a new quilt on the bed. It was thoughtful. But as I looked around, I noticed something odd. The door to the room next to mine was locked, not just closed, but locked with a heavy iron key. The next morning, I asked him about it over a silent breakfast. "The room next to mine," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's locked." His head snapped up. The warmth I'd thought I saw for a moment was gone, replaced by a shuttered, cold expression. "That room is not your concern," he said, his voice flat. "It's my office. It is to remain locked. You are not to enter it. Is that understood?" The command was so sharp, so absolute, it was like a slap in the face. I felt the blood drain from my cheeks. "Yes," I whispered. "I understand." For the rest of the day, a chill settled between us. I had married a stranger, a man with secrets he guarded with iron locks and cold commands. I walked to the schoolhouse, the familiar path a comfort in my new, unsettling life. The children's greetings were a balm to my frayed nerves. Here, I was Miss Wynne. I was known. I was safe. But that evening, as I lay in my bed in that silent, lonely house, the image of that locked door haunted me. What was he hiding in there? What secrets did my new husband possess? I told myself it wasn't my business. Our marriage was a contract, a practical arrangement. But my curiosity was a gnawing thing. I was a teacher. I sought knowledge. I solved puzzles. A week later, I found the spare key. It was tucked away in a small, dusty box on the top shelf of the linen closet. My heart pounded as I held the cold iron key in my hand. This was a betrayal of his trust, a violation of our agreement. But the need to know was stronger than my fear. That afternoon, while he was out on the range, I stood before the locked door, my hand trembling as I inserted the key. The lock turned with a rusty groan. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was not what I expected. It was an office, just as he'd said. A large oak desk dominated the space, but it was the walls that made me gasp. They were covered in maps of the county, legal documents, and newspaper clippings. Dozens of them, all yellowed with age. They were all about the same event, the accidental death of his father, Samuel Cutter, 20 years ago. The official story, the one I'd heard whispered in town, was that his father had died of a heart attack while working in the North Pasture. But the clippings told a different story. They spoke of a bitter land dispute. They spoke of threats. They spoke of a rival rancher whose name appeared again and again, circled in red ink. Marcus Blackwood. My blood ran cold. Blackwood owned the ranch that bordered ours. He was a charming, respected man in town, always quick with a smile and a donation for the church. But here, in Boaz's secret room, he was painted as a villain. I leaned closer, reading a faded article. Samuel Cutter's death has been ruled an accident, it said, but sources close to the family whisper of foul play, citing the ongoing and often heated disputes with neighbor Marcus Blackwood over water rights. Boaz believed his father had been murdered, and he had spent the last 20 years gathering evidence, living with this secret, this burning obsession for justice. My marriage, I realized with a sickening jolt, wasn't just about needing an heir. It was about something more. He was preparing for a war. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a horse approaching the house. Boaz was back, early. Panic seized me. I had to get out, lock the door, and pretend I had seen nothing. I turned to leave, but my eyes caught something on his desk. It was our marriage contract, and lying next to it was another document. A loan agreement from a bank back east. The loan was for a staggering amount of money, and the due date was in less than a month. The collateral for the loan was the entire Cutter Ranch. A single missed payment, and he would lose everything. Everything his father had built, everything he believed his father had died for. I finally understood the desperation I had seen in his eyes. He hadn't just been looking for a wife. He had been looking for a shield. A respectable, stable marriage to a school teacher would look good to the bankers. It would suggest permanence, stability. It might just convince them to extend his loan. My marriage was a sham, a business move in a high-stakes game against a man he believed was a murderer. I heard his heavy boots on the porch. I didn't have time to lock the door. I slipped out, pulling it shut behind me just as he walked into the house. He saw me standing in the hallway, my face pale, and his eyes narrowed. "What were you doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I couldn't lie. "Not about this." I was in your office," I whispered. The look on his face was terrifying. It was a mask of cold fury. For a moment, I thought he might strike me. He took a step toward me, his huge frame blocking out the light. "I told you never to go in that room," he growled, his voice a low threat. I had married a stranger, a man consumed by revenge and teetering on the edge of financial ruin. And I was trapped in his house, a pawn in his dangerous game. The fortress he had offered me was beginning to feel like a prison. And the warden was my husband. The fury in Boaz's eyes was a raw, terrifying thing. He looked at me as if I were a traitor, a spy in his camp. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and I braced myself, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had crossed a line, a sacred boundary, and I had no idea what he was capable of. "Why?" he bit out, the single word sharp as a shard of glass. "I needed to understand," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I am your wife, Boaz. Even if this is just an arrangement, I will not be a blind partner. I saw the clippings. I saw the loan agreement." The anger in his face slowly gave way to a weary resignation. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind the profound sadness I had first seen in his eyes. He sank into a chair at the kitchen table, his massive shoulders slumped. He looked not like a giant, but like a man crushed by an invisible weight. "So now you know," he said, his voice hollow. "You know you married a fool who's about to lose everything his father died for." I sat down opposite him, the wooden table a no-man's land between us. "Tell me," I urged gently. "Tell me everything. Start with Marcus Blackwood." And so he did. The story tumbled out of him, a torrent of grief and rage held back for 20 years. He told me about the land disputes, how Blackwood had systematically tried to choke the Cutter Ranch, damming streams, contesting boundaries. His father, Samuel, had been a good, trusting man who believed in the law. He was preparing to take Blackwood to court. "And then he was dead," Boaz said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "They called it a heart attack. He was 42 years old and strong as an ox. Blackwood was the one who found him. So convenient." After his father's death, Boaz, just 17, was left to run the ranch. The bank loans, which Blackwood had secretly co-signed and then manipulated, became a noose around his neck. Every year the terms grew tighter, the payments larger. Blackwood was bleeding him dry, waiting for him to fail. "Marrying you." He trailed off, unable to meet my eyes. It was a desperate move, a last-ditch effort to look stable for the bank, to show I was putting down roots, planning for the future. "I used you, Abigail. I'm sorry." The confession hung in the air. I should have felt betrayed, and a part of me did. I was a piece on his chessboard, a strategic move, but another part of me felt a surge of empathy for this broken man who had carried this burden alone for so long. "You didn't just use me, Boaz," I said softly. "You gave me a home. You offered me a future. Now let me help you fight for ours." He looked up, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. "How? Blackwood has all the power. He has the money, the influence. The bank is in his pocket." "He has power," I conceded. "But we have the truth, and we have this." I walked back to his office and returned with the oldest, most faded newspaper clipping. It mentioned a ranch hand who had quit suddenly right after Samuel's death, a man named Jedediah Stone. "What about him?" Boaz asked. "The article says he left for California. Have you ever tried to find him? He was there that day. He might have seen something." Boaz shook his head. "I was a boy. I didn't know where to start. By the time I did, the trail was cold." "Then we make it hot again," I said, a new fire kindling inside me. "I will write letters, to sheriff's offices, to land registries, to every town from here to the Pacific. I am a teacher, Boaz. I know how to find information. It's what I do." For the first time since I'd met him, a flicker of genuine hope lit his eyes. It was a fragile thing, but it was there. We had a plan, a slim chance. The next day, a carriage rolled up to the ranch. A man in a fine city suit stepped out, and my heart stopped. It was Marcus Blackwood. He wasn't alone. Beside him was another man, a man whose face was a ghost from my own past. Henry Morrison, the banker's son from Ohio, who had broken my heart, who had called me unworthy and sent me fleeing to this God-forsaken frontier. He looked older, his face etched with the soft lines of an easy life. But it was him, and he was standing beside the man trying to destroy my husband. "Abigail?" Henry's voice was a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Blackwood smiled, a predatory, triumphant smile. "It seems my new lawyer knows your wife, Cutter. Small world, isn't it?" My past and my present had just collided with the force of a train wreck. Henry, the man who had discarded me for not having a dowry, was now the legal weapon being aimed at my new life. He looked from me to Boaz, his expression hardening. "I'm his wife," I said, my voice cold as ice as I moved to stand beside Boaz, a united front. "His wife?" Henry scoffed. "Abby, this man is a brute, a bankrupt farmer playing at being a rancher. Blackwood has shown me the books. He's finished." He then lowered his voice for my ears only. "It's not too late. Leave him. I can help you." The arrogance of it, the sheer audacity, sent a wave of fury through me. I am exactly where I belong, Henry, I said, my voice dripping with contempt. Blackwood watched the exchange with amusement. Well, Cutter, he said, turning his attention to Boaz. Now that we're all acquainted, let's get to business. The bank has reviewed your situation. They've sent Mr. Morrison to oversee the foreclosure. You have 1 week to pay the loan in full, or the ranch is mine. 1 week. It was an impossible deadline. It was a death sentence for the ranch. Blackwood's smile widened. He looked directly at me, his eyes cold and cruel. It's a shame, really. Such a lovely home. But don't you worry, Mrs. Cutter. I'm sure I can find a place for you. A pretty woman like you shouldn't be left all alone. The threat was vile, unmistakable. Boaz took a step forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but I put a hand on his arm, holding him back. Showing anger was what Blackwood wanted. He wanted Boaz to lose control, to prove he was the brute Henry had called him. You will address my wife with respect, Boaz said, his voice lethally calm, and you will get off my land. Your land? Blackwood laughed. Not for long. He and Henry turned and walked back to their carriage, leaving us in the dust of their departure. The 1 week deadline hung in the air like a guillotine. That night, the fortress of the ranch felt more like a tomb. Boaz was silent, retreating back into his shell of despair. Hope was a luxury we could no longer afford. I sat at the desk in his office, my hands stained with ink, writing letter after letter, a frantic, desperate search for a ghost named Jedediah Stone. 2 days later, a reply came. Not from a sheriff, but from a small parish in a dusty corner of Arizona. The priest there had a record of a Jedediah Stone. He had passed away 5 years prior, but he had left something in the church's care, a sealed letter, to be opened only upon the request of a member of the Cutter family. My hands trembled as I showed the letter to Boaz. It was our only hope. I sent a telegram immediately, along with a copy of our marriage certificate, begging the priest to send the letter. We spent the next few days in an agony of waiting. Every passing hour was a tick of the clock towards our ruin. Boaz barely spoke. He worked from sunup to sundown, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion, as if hard labor could hold back the tide that was about to swallow us. The evening before the deadline, a rider brought the package. It was a thick, yellowed envelope, sealed with wax. Boaz's hands shook so badly he couldn't open it. I took it from him and broke the seal. Inside was a letter, written in a shaky, spidery hand. It was Jedediah's confession. He wrote that he had witnessed the argument between Samuel Cutter and Marcus Blackwood in the North Pasture. It wasn't about water rights. It was about something far more valuable. Gold. Jedediah wrote that Samuel had discovered a rich vein of gold on the land. He had refused to sell to Blackwood, intending to file the claim himself and use the wealth to secure his family's future. Blackwood, in a rage, had struck him. Samuel had fallen, hitting his head on a rock. It was murder, or at least manslaughter, and Blackwood had threatened to kill Jedediah if he ever spoke a word of it, giving him a pouch of gold to disappear. But that wasn't the most explosive part of the letter. At the bottom of the page, Jedediah had written one final, chilling sentence. Blackwood wasn't alone that day. There was another man with him, a younger man, who helped him move the body and make it look like a heart attack. He said his name was Morrison, Mr. Henry Morrison, Sr. My blood turned to ice. Henry's father, the respectable banker from my hometown in Ohio, the man who had forbidden my marriage to his son, was a party to murder. The reason Henry had broken our engagement wasn't my lack of a dowry. It was to silence me, to sever any connection between the Morrison and Cutter families, lest the secret ever come out. My entire life, my heartbreak, my flight to Wyoming, it had all been a lie, a carefully constructed piece of collateral damage in a 20-year-old crime. Boaz looked at me, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. Morrison, he whispered. The noose wasn't just around the ranch. It had been around my neck for years, and I had never even known it. And the man pulling the rope was walking back into our lives tomorrow to claim his final prize. The revelation struck us like a physical blow. We sat in the lamplight, The confession of a dead man lying between us, a ghost's testimony that rewrote our entire history. Henry Morrison Sr., the pillar of Ohio society, was a conspirator to murder, and his son, my former fiancé, was the instrument of our destruction. "This changes everything," Boaz said, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't just about land anymore. This is about my father's murder." "But it's our word against theirs," I said, my mind racing. "Jedediah is dead. This letter, Henry and Blackwood will say it's a forgery, a desperate lie from a bankrupt man." "Then we need more," Boaz declared, a fire reigniting in his eyes. He stood and paced the room, a caged lion. "Jedediah mentioned a pouch of gold. Blackwood paid him to run. Blackwood's not the kind of man to use his own money. He would have taken it from my father." He strode to the fireplace and pried a loose stone from the hearth. Behind it was a small, hidden compartment. He pulled out a worn leather ledger. "My father's private accounts," he explained, flipping through the pages. "He recorded everything." His finger stopped on an entry dated the day before his death. "Here. Withdrew 1 pouch of gold dust from the assay office for geological survey supplies. It was never found. Blackwood took it from his body." "It's still not enough, Boaz," I insisted, my voice tight with urgency. "It's circumstantial. We need proof that links Blackwood and Morrison Sr. together." My eyes fell on Henry's name. Henry Morrison Jr., the lawyer. Lawyers keep records. They keep correspondence. What if his father had written to him? Confessed? Warned him? "Henry is staying at the hotel in Sage Creek," I said, a desperate plan forming in my mind. His room, his briefcase. He might have letters from his father. Boaz looked at me, his expression grim. "Abigail, that's too dangerous. If you're caught—" "If we do nothing, we lose everything anyway," I countered. "I know Henry. I know how he thinks. He's arrogant. He's careless. He won't be expecting me." Before he could argue, I was already moving, pulling my darkest cloak around my shoulders. I would ride to Sage Creek under the cover of darkness. It was a reckless, mad plan, but it was the only one we had. The ride was a blur of wind and fear. I tethered my horse in an alley behind the hotel and slipped in through the service entrance. The night clerk was asleep at his desk. I crept up the stairs, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew Henry's room number. The clerk had circled it on the guest register. The lock was simple. A hairpin from my bun and a trick my father had taught me for opening jammed cabinets was all it took. I slipped inside the room. It smelled of expensive cologne and cigars, the scent of a life I had once thought I wanted. His leather briefcase was on the desk. My fingers trembled as I fumbled with the latches. It sprang open. Inside was a stack of legal documents related to the foreclosure, and underneath them, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. They were from his father. I scanned them quickly, my eyes devouring the spidery script. They were mostly business, instructions on how to handle the Cutter foreclosure. But then I found it. A more recent letter, dated just last week. Henry Morrison Sr. was dying, and his conscience was getting the better of him. "Son," the letter read, "the Cutter business weighs heavily on me. What we did all those years ago was a terrible sin. Blackwood was a devil, and I allowed myself to be pulled into his darkness. I know you believe the man died of a fall, but there was more to it. Blackwood was enraged. He struck the first blow. I have kept the original deed to the north pasture, the one showing Cutter's gold claim all these years. It is my only proof of what truly happened, my only penance. It is hidden in my private safe. The combination is your mother's birthday. If Blackwood ever betrays you, use it. God forgive me." My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the paper. This was it, the smoking gun, proof of the gold claim, proof that the deed Blackwood held was a forgery and a confession from his own partner in crime. I heard footsteps in the hall, heavy, deliberate footsteps. It wasn't Henry. It was someone else. I stuffed the letters into my cloak and darted for the door just as it swung open. A large man, one of Blackwood's hired guns I'd seen at the ranch, filled the doorway. His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with menace. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself forward, ducking under his outstretched arm, and ran. I fled down the hallway, down the stairs, past the now-awake clerk who shouted in alarm. I burst out into the night and scrambled for my horse. He was right behind me. I heard a gunshot, the bullet whistling past my ear. I leaped into the saddle and dug my heels into the horse's flanks, flying out of the alley and onto the dark road back to the ranch. When I burst through the door, waving the letters, Boaz's face was a mixture of terror and relief. "They know," I gasped. "Blackwood's man was there. They'll be coming." "Let them come," Boaz said, his voice a low growl as he read the confession. He walked to the gun cabinet, a place I hadn't even known existed, and took out a heavy Winchester rifle. He checked the action with a practiced ease that sent a chill down my spine. This was not just a rancher. This was a man who knew how to fight. "You were a soldier," I whispered. A statement, not a question. 3 years, he said, not looking at me. I swore I'd never touch a gun again, but Blackwood has left me no choice. He threatened my wife. He's coming for my home. This ends tonight. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon when they arrived. Not just Blackwood and Henry and a single hired gun, but a dozen men, all armed, all riding under Blackwood's banner. They weren't just coming to serve a foreclosure notice. They were coming to wipe us off the map. They fanned out, surrounding the house. We were trapped. Outnumbered. "Cutter!" Blackwood's voice boomed across the yard. "You've caused me enough trouble. Send out the woman, and I might let you walk away with your life." Boaz stood at the window, his rifle steady in his hands. "The only way you're setting foot in this house is over my dead body." "That can be arranged," Blackwood snarled. From my position at the kitchen window, I saw Henry sitting on his horse behind the main group, his face pale and frightened. He was a lawyer, a man of papers and contracts, not guns and violence. He was in over his head. "Boaz," I said, my voice low and urgent. "There's no way we can fight them all. They'll burn us out." "I won't let them have you, Abigail," he said, his voice fierce with a protectiveness that warmed me to my soul. "You won't have to," I said, my teacher's mind clicking into place, seeing patterns and possibilities. They expect a fight. They don't expect a lesson. I grabbed the heavy school bell I kept on the mantelpiece. "Get ready to run," I told him, "and for God's sake, don't shoot Henry." Before he could ask what I meant, I kicked open the back door and began to ring the bell with all my might, the loud, clear peals echoing across the prairie. It wasn't a signal of surrender. It was a signal for school to begin. Blackwood's men looked confused. The sound was unexpected, bizarre. What was this woman doing? Then, over the rise behind the ranch, they appeared. First a few, then a dozen, then more. The ranchers from the surrounding homesteads, the shopkeepers from town, men I had taught, whose children I was now teaching. They had heard about Blackwood's threats, about the impossible deadline. Boaz wasn't as alone as he thought. They came with old shotguns and hunting rifles, a makeshift militia drawn together by a sense of frontier justice. They had answered the school bell. Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. His plan for a quick, brutal siege had just turned into a small war. "Fire!" he screamed, and the yard erupted in a hail of gunfire. But in that first moment of chaos, as Blackwood's men turned to face the new threat, Boaz and I slipped out the back and ran for the cover of the rocky hills behind the ranch. We had the letters. We had the proof. We just had to live long enough to use them. We scrambled up the rocks, bullets kicking up dust around our feet. Boaz laid down covering fire, his Winchester barking with deadly accuracy. He moved with a soldier's economy, calm and focused in the midst of chaos. "The old mine shaft!" he yelled over the din. "To the north!" We ran, hunched low, the battle raging behind us. It was a desperate gamble. Blackwood wanted the letters, and he wanted us dead. He wouldn't let us escape. He and a few of his men broke off from the main fight and came after us. We reached the abandoned mine shaft just as they closed in. It was a dark, gaping maw in the side of the hill. "Get inside!" Boaz ordered. pushing me toward the darkness. "Not without you!" I cried. "I'll hold them off," he said, turning to face our pursuers. "Go!" A bullet struck the rock near his head, showering him with stone fragments. He didn't flinch. He was a giant, a lone warrior standing against the tide, buying me time with his own life. I stumbled back into the mine, the precious letters clutched to my chest. I could hear the sharp crack of his Winchester, answered by the volley of shots from Blackwood's men. Then I heard a cry of pain. Boaz's cry, followed by a triumphant shout from Marcus Blackwood. "He's down! The rancher is down!" My world collapsed. I stood frozen in the darkness of the mine, the smell of gunpowder and death in the air. I could hear them approaching, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. "The woman's in the mine!" Blackwood yelled. "Find her, and find those letters!" I was alone, trapped in the dark. My husband was wounded or worse, and the monsters were coming for me. The darkness of the mine was absolute, a thick, cold blanket that smothered sound and sight. I backed away from the entrance, my hands outstretched, feeling my way along the rough-hewn rock. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Boaz was down. The thought was a shard of ice in my soul. "Spread out!" Blackwood's voice echoed from the entrance. "She can't have gone far. Find her!" I could see the flickering lights of their lanterns painting dancing, monstrous shadows on the tunnel walls. They were coming. I pressed myself into a small alcove, making myself as small as possible, clutching the precious letters. They were my only weapon now, and a poor one at that. A figure appeared at the mouth of the tunnel, silhouetted by the daylight. It was Henry. He held a lantern, but no gun. His face was a pale mask of terror. "Abigail?" he whispered into the darkness. "Abby, for God's sake, give him the letters. He'll kill you." "Like he killed Samuel Cutter?" I hissed back from the shadows. "Like your father helped him?" He flinched, as if I had struck him. "I didn't know," he stammered. "Not the whole truth. I swear it. My father said it was an accident. I never knew about the gold." "But you came here to ruin a man anyway," I accused, my voice dripping with contempt. "It was business. I didn't know it was this." He gestured wildly back toward the ranch, where the sounds of gunfire still echoed. Another figure loomed behind him. Blackwood. "Have you found her?" he demanded. "She's in here," Henry said, his voice trembling. "She won't come out." "Then we go in," Blackwood snarled, shoving Henry forward into the tunnel. "And you, lawyer, are going to earn your fee." I scrambled deeper into the mine, my feet slipping on loose gravel. The tunnel branched, and I took the path to the right, praying it didn't lead to a dead end. The air grew stale, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. The light from their lanterns grew closer. I was running out of time, running out of tunnel. I came to a place where the passage opened into a small cavern. In the center was a deep, black pit, crisscrossed with rotting timbers, a vertical shaft that plunged into the earth. I was trapped. Blackwood and Henry entered the cavern, their lanterns flooding the space with light. Blackwood's face was a mask of triumphant evil. "Nowhere left to run, schoolteacher." He stepped toward me, his hand outstretched. "The letters." I held them up. "You want them? Come and get them." I backed up slowly, moving closer to the edge of the pit. "Don't be a fool, woman," Blackwood sneered. "Your husband is dead or dying. Your friends are losing. It's over." "It's not over until I say it is," I shot back, my voice echoing in the cavern. Suddenly, a groan came from the main tunnel. A shape emerged from the darkness, staggering, covered in dust and blood. It was Boaz. He was alive. He had a deep gash on his forehead, and his left arm hung uselessly at his side, but he was on his feet. In his right hand, he held a heavy pickaxe he must have found in the mine. "Get away from my wife," he growled, his voice a raw sound of pure fury. Blackwood spun around, his gun coming up, but he was too slow. Boaz swung the pickaxe in a great arc, not at Blackwood, but at the support timbers above the tunnel entrance. With a splintering crash, the timbers gave way. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down, sealing the tunnel. We were all trapped. Me, Boaz, Henry, and a murderer, sealed in a tomb deep inside the earth. "You fool!" Blackwood screamed, his composure finally shattering. "You've killed us all!" "Better to die in here with my wife than let you walk out into the sun," Boaz said, his breathing ragged as he leaned against the rockfall for support. Blackwood turned his rage on Boaz, firing his pistol. Boaz crumpled to the ground. I screamed and ran to him, dropping the letters to kneel at his side. The bullet had hit him in the leg. He was bleeding badly. Blackwood advanced on us, a sick smile on his face. "Well, this simplifies things. I'll take the letters, finish the job, and see if I can't dig my way out." He bent down to pick up the letters from the floor. As his fingers brushed against them, Henry moved. With a cry of desperation, he lunged at Blackwood, trying to wrestle the gun away. The two men struggled, their grunts and curses echoing in the confined space. A shot went off, the sound deafening. Henry cried out and fell back, clutching his chest. Blackwood stood over him, the smoking gun in his hand. "Always hated whining lawyers." He turned back to me, his eyes gleaming with madness in the flickering lamplight. He had the letters. He had the gun. Boaz was wounded. Henry was dying. It truly was over. He leveled the pistol at my head. "Any last words, schoolteacher?" I looked past him, at the dark pit in the center of the cavern, and at the rotting timbers that spanned its width. An idea, a terrible, desperate idea, sparked in my mind. "Just one," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "What's 7 times 8? Blackwood stared at me, confused. "What?" "It's a multiplication question, Mr. Blackwood," I said, channeling all the authority of my classroom. "Tommy Fletcher has trouble with it. I was wondering if you knew the answer." His face contorted with rage at my apparent madness. "I've had enough of your games," he roared, taking a step toward me. That one step was all I needed. He stepped directly onto the most rotten of the old timbers spanning the pit. I didn't wait to see if it would hold. I threw myself sideways, grabbing the lantern and hurling it at the far wall. The cavern was plunged into absolute darkness. I heard a splintering crack, a scream of pure terror that was cut off abruptly, and then a long, fading sound of something falling, bouncing off the walls of the shaft, before it ended with a final, sickening thud far below. Silence. A thick, profound silence filled the tomb. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint, pained gasps of my husband. "Abigail?" Boaz's voice was a weak whisper in the dark. "I'm here," I choked out, crawling toward the sound of his voice. My hand found his. It was warm and real. "I'm here." We were alive. We were sealed in a cave deep underground with a dying man and the body of a murderer at the bottom of a pit. But we were alive, and we were together. Slowly, painfully, we began to hope. The battle outside couldn't last forever. Our friends knew where we had gone. They would look for us. They would dig. All we had to do was survive. I tore strips from my petticoat to bind Boaz's wounds. I spoke to Henry, who was fading fast. With his last breath, he whispered an apology for his weakness, for his father's sins. Then there was only waiting. Hours passed like years in the crushing dark. We talked, our voices low, conserving our energy, our air. He told me about his time as a soldier. I told him about my lonely years in Ohio. We stripped away the last of our secrets, leaving only the raw, honest truth of who we were. In that tomb, we finally, truly found each other. It was love born not in sunlight and flowers, but in darkness and desperation. A love forged in fire and sealed in the earth. Just when I thought all hope was lost, when the air was growing thin and Boaz had fallen unconscious, I heard it. A faint scratching sound from the rockfall. Scraping, digging, voices. They had found us. Light streamed in as the first rock was pulled away. The faces of our friends, grimy and exhausted, peered into the darkness. They had won the battle. Blackwood's remaining men had surrendered or fled, and they had come back for us. They carried Boaz out into the glorious sunlight. They helped me stumble out after him, blinking against the brightness of a world I thought I would never see again. I still had the letters, crumpled and stained with dirt, but safe. The proof. The truth. The nightmare was over. Months later, with Boaz healed and the ranch secure, the past was finally laid to rest. The letters, along with the testimony of the ranchers, were enough to clear the Cutter name forever. The gold claim was real, and it secured our future beyond our wildest dreams. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky, Boaz took my hand. His father's pocket watch was in his palm. He opened it, revealing not the watch face but a small hidden compartment. Inside was a tiny folded piece of paper. On it was a faded drawing of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "My mother," he said softly. She was a teacher too. He carried this with him always. He said she was his true north, his foundation. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a love so deep it took my breath away. "You're my true north, Abigail. You're the foundation of this home, of this life." I had come to this land seeking refuge, and instead, I had found a war. I had agreed to a practical arrangement and found an epic love. The spinster schoolteacher had become a warrior, a wife, a partner. A year later, I stood in the doorway of a new room Boaz had built onto the house, a nursery. In my arms, I held our son, Samuel. He had his father's strong frame and my curious eyes. The prairie stretched out before us, no longer a symbol of loneliness, but a land of promise. A land where a quiet schoolteacher and a broken rancher could fight their demons, build a fortress of love, and find their own practical happy ending. Our story wasn't a fairy tale. It was better. It was real. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. Because the greatest tales aren't just about heroes and villains, but about ordinary people who find extraordinary strength when love gives them something worth fighting for.